41-year-old Markeith Lloyd sat shackled in the Orange County courtroom in Orlando, Florida, on March 2, 2022, wearing red-tinted glasses to hide the permanent damage to his eye from his violent arrest 5 years earlier, as Judge Letitia Marquez announced the sentence that the jury had unanimously recommended: death by lethal injection for the cold-blooded execution-style murder of Orlando Police Lieutenant Deborah Clayton on January 9, 2017. Outside a Walmart store where Lieutenant Clayton had bravely confronted Lloyd, despite knowing he was a fugitive wanted for murdering his pregnant ex-girlfriend Sade Dixon and their unborn child just weeks earlier. As the death sentence was pronounced, Markeith showed no visible emotion, the same cold indifference he had displayed in the interrogation room on January 17, 2017. When detectives questioned him for 43 minutes after his dramatic capture following a 9-day manhunt that paralyzed Orlando, an interrogation captured entirely on video where Markeith, showing zero remorse, actually smiled and smirked while discussing the murders, told detectives, "You did what you did. If you have to defend yourself, that's what it was. But you be a man." Essentially acknowledging both killings while trying to justify them as self-defense, despite overwhelming evidence showing he executed Lieutenant Clayton in cold blood as she tried to arrest him, and provided details only the killer would know about shooting Sade Dixon and their unborn baby weeks earlier, all while displaying an arrogant, defiant attitude that demonstrated to the jury exactly who Markeith Lloyd was: a remorseless cop killer who deserved the ultimate punishment. Before we continue with this disturbing case, please subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support is what allows us to continue bringing these important stories to light. The 43-minute interrogation video, along with hours of additional footage showing Markeith's interactions with officers and detectives in the days following his capture, became the prosecution's most powerful weapon at trial. Not because Markeith explicitly confessed, "I murdered them," but because his demeanor, his smirking and smiling when discussing the deaths, his statements attempting to justify the murders, his lack of remorse, and his visible hatred of law enforcement revealed exactly who he was: a man who hated police so deeply that he murdered one in cold blood, who killed his pregnant ex-girlfriend and her brother in a jealous rage, and who showed not 1 ounce of human empathy or regret for destroying 3 lives and an unborn baby. This is the story of Markeith Lloyd, a career criminal whose violent hatred of police exploded into a shooting spree that left a decorated police lieutenant, a young pregnant woman, her brother, and an unborn child dead. How his 9-day manhunt paralyzed Orlando and resulted in the death of another officer in a traffic accident during the search. How his capture was documented on body cameras showing his violent resistance. And how the interrogation footage showing him smiling and showing no remorse became the evidence that sealed his fate and sent him to Florida's death row, where he remains today, still appealing his conviction while the families of his victims continue to grieve the loved ones he stole from them. Markeith Lloyd was born on December 11, 1976, in Orlando, Florida, into a family and community plagued by poverty, violence, and systemic dysfunction. His childhood was marked by instability. His father was largely absent, in and out of prison for various offenses, while his mother struggled with substance abuse and was often unable to provide consistent care for Markeith and his siblings. By his early teenage years, Markeith was already involved in street gangs, selling drugs, and committing petty crimes that would escalate into increasingly serious offenses as he aged. Markeith's first adult arrest came at age 18 for armed robbery. Over the next 2 decades, He accumulated an extensive criminal record, including multiple felony convictions for robbery, aggravated assault, weapons charges, drug trafficking, and battery. He served multiple prison sentences totaling over 15 years, cycling in and out of Florida's correctional system, released on parole, committing new crimes, returning to prison, released again in an endless cycle that characterized his entire adult life. Friends and family who knew Markeith described him as intelligent and charismatic when he wanted to be, but also volatile, paranoid, and increasingly radicalized against authority, particularly law enforcement. By the mid-2010s, Markeith had developed an intense hatred of police that he expressed frequently on social media, posting rants about police brutality, systemic racism, and his belief that violence against law enforcement was justified and necessary. His Facebook page was filled with posts calling police pigs, advocating for armed resistance against officers, and celebrating instances of police officers being killed or injured in the line of duty. These social media posts would later be presented at trial as evidence of Markeith's premeditation and hatred toward law enforcement. In 2015, Markeith met Sade Dixon, a 24-year-old woman working in retail and trying to build a stable life for herself. Sade became pregnant with Markeith's child in early 2016, and their relationship, troubled from the start, quickly deteriorated into violence and control. Sade's family later told investigators that Markeith was possessive and abusive, that he had threatened Sade multiple times when she tried to leave him, and that she had been trying to distance herself from him, but was terrified of how he would react if she completely cut him off. By November 2016, Sade was 7 months pregnant with Markeith's son and had made the difficult decision to end her relationship with Markeith permanently. She had moved in with her brother Ronald Stewart for safety and was making plans to raise her child without Markeith's involvement, knowing that Markeith's criminal lifestyle and violent tendencies made him unfit to be a father. But Markeith refused to accept this decision. He continued contacting Sade obsessively, showing up at her workplace unannounced, making threats about what would happen if she kept his child from him, and demanding she give their relationship another chance. Sade's family urged her to file for a restraining order, and she finally did in early December 2016, but the order had not yet been served on Markeith when tragedy struck. On the morning of December 13, 2016, Markeith drove to Ronald Stewart's home located at 5100 Faith Terrace Drive in Orlando, where Sade had been living for several weeks. Markeith had been calling and texting Sade all morning, demanding she speak with him, but Sade had ignored his messages, knowing any conversation with Markeith would likely escalate into an argument or worse. Around 11:00 a.m., frustrated by Sade's refusal to respond, Markeith decided to confront her in person. When Markeith arrived at the house, Sade was in the front yard with Ronald, who was working on his car. According to witnesses and forensic reconstruction of the scene, Markeith exited his vehicle and immediately began arguing with Sade about her decision to keep their unborn son away from him. The argument escalated quickly, with Markeith becoming increasingly agitated and Sade standing her ground, telling him their relationship was over and he needed to leave. What happened next was captured partially on a neighbor's home security camera and was later reconstructed through ballistic evidence and witness testimony. Markeith pulled out a handgun, a 9mm pistol he had purchased illegally weeks earlier, and shot Sade multiple times at close range. She fell to the ground, mortally wounded, clutching her pregnant belly as Markeith stood over her and fired additional shots, killing both Sade and their unborn baby in a rage-fueled execution. Ronald Stewart, witnessing his pregnant sister being murdered in front of him, ran toward Markeith, trying to stop the attack or protect Sade. Markeith turned the gun on Ronald and shot him multiple times as well, killing him almost instantly. Within less than 2 minutes, Markeith had murdered 2 people and an unborn child, leaving their bodies in the front yard in broad daylight, while neighbors watched in horror from behind their windows, too terrified to intervene. Markeith fled the scene in his vehicle, driving away calmly as if nothing had happened. Neighbors called 911, and within minutes, Orlando police arrived to find Sade and Ronald dead in the yard. Paramedics attempted to save Sade's unborn baby through emergency C-section, but the baby had been killed by the gunshots to Sade's abdomen. The medical examiner would later testify that Sade had been shot 7 times, including shots to her abdomen that specifically targeted her pregnancy, suggesting Markeith intentionally killed their unborn child as part of his murderous rage. The double homicide sparked an immediate and massive manhunt. Orlando Police Department, Orange County Sheriff's Office, and multiple other law enforcement agencies in Central Florida dedicated hundreds of officers to finding Markeith Lloyd before he could kill again. His photograph was plastered across local news stations, social media, and billboards throughout the Orlando area. A $60,000 reward was offered for information leading to his capture. Law enforcement made it clear Markeith Lloyd was armed, dangerous, and had already shown his willingness to kill without hesitation. For the next 4 weeks, from December 13, 2016, through January 9, 2017, Markeith evaded capture despite being one of the most wanted fugitives in Florida. He moved between safe houses provided by friends and family members who aided him, despite knowing he was wanted for murder, changed his appearance by shaving his head and growing facial hair, and avoided public places where he might be recognized. Law enforcement conducted dozens of raids on homes where they believed Markeith might be hiding, but he always seemed to stay one step ahead, likely receiving tips from associates about police movements. During this time, Markeith's hatred of police intensified into paranoid obsession. According to later testimony from people who saw him during those 4 weeks, Markeith told multiple people he would never be taken alive, that he would shoot any police officer who tried to arrest him, and that he was prepared to die in a shootout rather than go back to prison. He was wearing a bulletproof vest at all times, even while sleeping, and carrying multiple weapons, including the 9mm pistol he had used to kill Sade and Ronald, as well as additional firearms he had obtained from associates. Markeith was a ticking time bomb, and everyone in law enforcement knew it was only a matter of time before another violent confrontation occurred. That confrontation came on the morning of January 9, 2017, at a Walmart supercenter located at 3101 West Colonial Drive in Orlando, a busy location in a residential area where hundreds of customers shop daily, particularly in the early morning hours when people stop for groceries on their way to work. Markeith, desperate for food and supplies after 4 weeks of hiding, decided to risk a quick trip to the Walmart around 7 a.m. when he thought the store would be relatively empty and the chances of being recognized would be minimal. Markeith entered the Walmart wearing a baseball cap, sunglasses, baggy clothing to hide his bulletproof vest, and carrying a concealed handgun. He grabbed a shopping cart and began moving quickly through the aisles, keeping his head down and trying to avoid eye contact with other shoppers and employees. But fate, or perhaps Markeith's arrogance in thinking he could go to a public place without being recognized, intervened. A Walmart customer named Samuel Hernandez was shopping in the store that morning and passed Markeith in one of the aisles. Something about Markeith looked familiar to Hernandez. Despite the hat and sunglasses, Hernandez recognized Markeith's face from the extensive news coverage of the manhunt. Hernandez, not wanting to confront a dangerous fugitive, calmly exited the aisle, left his shopping cart, and walked toward the front of the store, looking for a police officer or security guard. What Hernandez found was even better. Orlando Police Lieutenant Deborah Clayton was working an off-duty security detail at the Walmart that morning. A common assignment where uniformed officers provide security at retail stores during their off hours. Lieutenant Clayton, 42 years old, was a 17-year veteran of the Orlando Police Department who had risen through the ranks from patrol officer to sergeant to her recent promotion to lieutenant. She was married with a teenage son, was deeply involved in her church community, and was known throughout OPD as a dedicated professional officer who led by example and never backed down from danger. Hernandez approached Lieutenant Clayton and told her urgently, "The guy everyone's looking for, Markeith Lloyd. He's in the store right now. I just saw him." Lieutenant Clayton immediately radioed for backup, reporting that the fugitive wanted for double homicide was inside the Walmart. She instructed Hernandez to stay safe and exit the area, then positioned herself near the customer service desk at the front of the store, watching the exits while waiting for backup units to arrive and establish a perimeter. At approximately 7:17 a.m., Markeith Lloyd emerged from the main shopping area of the Walmart and began walking toward the exit doors. He had apparently finished his shopping and was heading back to his vehicle, unaware that his presence had been reported to police and that Lieutenant Clayton was waiting for him. The moment Markeith passed through the automatic doors and stepped outside into the parking lot, he saw Lieutenant Clayton in her full Orlando police uniform, standing beside her marked patrol vehicle, clearly watching him with her hand resting on her duty weapon. What happened next was captured on multiple surveillance cameras from the Walmart and surrounding businesses, and the footage would later be played at trial showing the final moments of Lieutenant Deborah Clayton's life. The video shows Markeith immediately recognize that the uniformed officer is there for him. For a split second, he freezes, calculating his options: surrender peacefully, run, or fight. Markeith chose the option that would seal his fate. He reached for his concealed handgun. Lieutenant Clayton, seeing Markeith reach for a weapon, drew her duty weapon and commanded him to show his hands and get on the ground. But Markeith had no intention of surrendering. He pulled out his 9mm pistol, the same weapon he had used to murder Sade Dixon and Ronald Stewart 4 weeks earlier, and opened fire on Lieutenant Clayton without hesitation, without warning, in a deliberate attempt to kill a police officer who was simply trying to do her job and take a dangerous fugitive into custody. The surveillance footage shows multiple muzzle flashes as Markeith fired repeatedly at Lieutenant Clayton. She returned fire, both officers shooting at each other from a distance of approximately 15 to 20 feet in the Walmart parking lot. Customers and employees who were entering and exiting the store scattered and dove for cover, terrified as gunshots erupted in what should have been a routine morning shopping trip. The entire shootout lasted approximately 20 seconds. A chaotic, violent exchange of gunfire that left Lieutenant Clayton mortally wounded. Lieutenant Clayton was struck by multiple bullets, one hitting her in the neck, severing her carotid artery and causing massive bleeding, and another striking her in the chest. Despite being shot, and despite knowing she was gravely wounded, Lieutenant Clayton continued to fight, continuing to fire her weapon at Markeith, even as she collapsed to the ground. Her final act was attempting to call for help on her radio, pressing the emergency button that would alert all Orlando police units that an officer was down and needed immediate assistance. Markeith, wearing his bulletproof vest, was struck by at least 3 of Lieutenant Clayton's rounds, but the vest stopped the bullets from penetrating his chest. Realizing Lieutenant Clayton was down and that backup would be arriving any second, Markeith ran from the scene, abandoning his vehicle and fleeing on foot into the residential neighborhood surrounding the Walmart. He ran several blocks before stealing a car from a nearby driveway, pistol whipping the owner who tried to stop him, then driving away from the area as police sirens converged from every direction. Lieutenant Deborah Clayton was rushed to Orlando Regional Medical Center by the first officers who arrived on scene, but her injuries were catastrophic. Despite the efforts of trauma surgeons, she was pronounced dead at 8:13 a.m. on January 9th, 2017, less than an hour after she had confronted Markeith Lloyd in the Walmart parking lot. She became the 54th Orlando police officer to be killed in the line of duty in the department's history, and the first female OPD officer to be killed by gunfire in the line of duty. The murder of Lieutenant Clayton transformed the manhunt for Markeith Lloyd from a high-priority fugitive case into the most intensive and emotional manhunt in Orlando Police Department history. Every available officer from OPD was mobilized, along with hundreds of officers from surrounding agencies including Orange County Sheriff's Office, Seminole County Sheriff's Office, Osceola County Sheriff's Office, and Florida Highway Patrol. The FBI deployed its fugitive task force. U.S. Marshals joined the search. Helicopters, K-9 units, SWAT teams, and street crimes units saturated the areas where Markeith was believed to be hiding. The manhunt was not only the largest in Orlando's history, but it was also deeply personal for every officer involved. Markeith had murdered one of their own, a respected lieutenant, a mother, a wife, a colleague who had dedicated 17 years of her life to protecting the Orlando community. Officers working the manhunt were running on pure adrenaline and determination, working 16-hour shifts, skipping meals and sleep, focused entirely on finding Markeith Lloyd and bringing him to justice. Tragically, the manhunt claimed another life. On January 9th, the same day Lieutenant Clayton was killed, Orange County Sheriff's Office Deputy First Class Norman Lewis was killed in a traffic accident while responding to a reported sighting of Markeith. Deputy Lewis was riding his motorcycle at high speed toward the location when he collided with another vehicle, suffering fatal injuries. He died shortly afterward at the hospital, becoming the second law enforcement officer to lose his life in connection with Markeith Lloyd's crimes. The Orlando law enforcement community was devastated. 2 officers dead in one day because of one violent criminal. For the next 8 days, from January 9th through January 17th, 2017, Markeith remained at large despite the massive manhunt. He was hiding in an abandoned house in the Carver Shores neighborhood of Orlando, an area he knew well from his years living in the city. Friends and family members were secretly bringing him food, water, and supplies, risking their own arrest to help him evade capture. Several of these individuals would later be arrested and charged with accessory after the fact for harboring a fugitive. On the evening of January 16th, 2017, Orlando police received a tip from a confidential informant that Markeith was hiding in a specific abandoned house on Lescott Lane in the Carver Shores neighborhood. The informant, whose identity has never been publicly revealed, provided detailed information about which house Markeith was in, how he was armed, and that he had repeatedly stated he would not surrender and would shoot any officer who tried to arrest him. Acting on this intelligence, Orlando police organized a tactical operation to capture Markeith on the morning of January 17th. OPD's SWAT team, along with officers from Orange County Sheriff's Office and U.S. Marshals, established a perimeter around the abandoned house. Snipers were positioned on rooftops with clear views of the exits. Armored vehicles were brought in to provide cover for officers. The plan was to contain Markeith inside the house, attempt to negotiate his surrender using loudspeakers and phone calls, and if necessary, use tear gas and tactical entry to force him out. At approximately 7 a.m. on January 17th, officers began announcing over loudspeakers that they knew Markeith was inside, that the house was surrounded, and that he should exit with his hands up. For nearly an hour, Markeith refused to respond or emerge from the house. Officers could see movement inside through the windows, confirming he was there, but was not complying with commands to surrender. Around 8:20 a.m., the tactical team made the decision to deploy tear gas into the house to force Markeith out. Multiple canisters of tear gas were fired through the windows, filling the structure with choking chemical irritant that would make it impossible to remain inside. Within minutes, Markeith emerged from a side door of the house, coughing from the tear gas, wearing his bulletproof vest, and allegedly reaching toward his waistband where officers believed he had a weapon. What happened next was captured on multiple officer body cameras and would become the subject of extensive debate. Officers commanded Markeith to show his hands and get on the ground. Instead, Markeith allegedly continued reaching toward his waistband. Officers perceived this as him reaching for a weapon, and multiple officers opened fire, striking Markeith with several rounds. Markeith went down, and officers immediately moved in to secure him, kicking away a loaded handgun that was found near his body. Markeith had been shot multiple times, including one round that struck him in the left eye, causing permanent damage that would later require him to wear special glasses for the rest of his life. But he was alive, wounded but conscious. Paramedics arrived and provided emergency medical treatment, and Markeith was transported under heavy guard to Orlando Regional Medical Center, ironically the same hospital where Lieutenant Clayton had been taken and pronounced dead 8 days earlier. The body camera footage of Markeith's capture shows officers celebrating and expressing relief that the manhunt was finally over, that the cop killer had been caught. Some officers were shouting expletives at Markeith as he lay wounded, expressing their anger and grief over Lieutenant Clayton's murder. This footage would later be criticized by defense attorneys as showing excessive force and unprofessional conduct, but prosecutors argued it showed the raw human emotion of officers who had just captured the man who had murdered one of their own. Markeith underwent surgery to treat his gunshot wounds, including the injury to his eye. He survived and was placed under 24-hour guard at the hospital while recovering. On January 20th, 2017, Markeith was formally charged with first-degree murder with a firearm for the death of Lieutenant Deborah Clayton, along with additional charges of attempted first-degree murder of other officers who were present during the Walmart shooting, carjacking, and weapons violations. He was also charged separately with the December 13th, 2016, murders of Sade Dixon and Ronald Stewart. On January 21st, 2017, just 4 days after his capture, Orlando police detectives conducted a videotaped interrogation of Markeith Lloyd at the Orange County Jail. This 43-minute interrogation would become some of the most damning evidence against him at trial, not because Markeith explicitly confessed to the murders, but because his demeanor, his statements, and his complete lack of remorse revealed exactly who he was and why he deserved the death penalty. The interrogation video, played in its entirety at both of Markeith's trials, shows a different side of him than the defiant, violent fugitive who had just been captured. Markeith appears calm, almost relaxed, sitting at the interrogation table, wearing red prison scrubs and with bandages over his damaged left eye. He speaks coherently and intelligently with detectives Teresa Sprague and Aaron Smith, showing he understood exactly what was happening despite the defense's later claims that he was too injured and medicated to knowingly waive his rights. Detective Sprague began by reading Markeith his Miranda rights, which he indicated he understood. She then asked if he would speak with them about what happened at the Walmart on January 9th. Markeith initially said he wanted a lawyer, but then, apparently unable to resist the urge to justify his actions, he began talking anyway, making statements that would later be used against him at trial. Most disturbingly, at several points during the interrogation, Markeith smiled and smirked when discussing the shootings. When Detective Sprague mentioned Lieutenant Clayton, Markeith smiled slightly and said, "You did what you did. If you have to defend yourself, that's what it was. But you be a man." This statement, essentially acknowledging he shot Lieutenant Clayton while trying to justify it as self-defense, was devastating evidence because it showed Markeith knew exactly what he had done and was attempting to rationalize cold-blooded murder as self-defense. When Detective Sprague asked about the December murders of Sade Dixon and Ronald Stewart, Markeith's response was equally chilling. He said, "Man, that's my baby mama. That situation happened. I had to defend myself. She came at me. Her brother came at me. What was I supposed to do?" This statement, essentially admitting he killed Sade and Ronald while trying to claim self-defense, contradicted all the physical evidence showing Sade and Ronald were victims of an unprovoked attack, not aggressors who forced Markeith to defend himself. Throughout the interrogation, Markeith displayed a combination of arrogance, defiance, and disturbing calmness. He showed no remorse for Lieutenant Clayton's death, no sadness for his unborn child, no acknowledgement that he had done anything wrong. Instead, he portrayed himself as a victim of police persecution, of a system stacked against him, of circumstances beyond his control. This victim mentality, displayed so prominently in the video, would later be used by prosecutors to show the jury that Markeith was not someone who had made mistakes, but someone who fundamentally lacked empathy, remorse, or human decency. At one point in the interrogation, Detective Smith asked Markeith, "Do you understand that a police officer died?" Markeith responded with a slight smile and said, "I understand a lot of things happened, but I'm still here, and I'm going to fight this in court." The smile, captured clearly on camera when discussing a police officer's death, would become one of the most powerful images shown to the jury, demonstrating Markeith's complete lack of humanity. The interrogation ended after 43 minutes when Markeith definitively invoked his right to an attorney, cutting off further questioning. But the damage was done. He had already made multiple admissions, shown his lack of remorse, and revealed his true character on camera. The video would be played at both of his trials. First, in October 2019, for the murder of Sade Dixon and Ronald Stewart, and then in October 2021 through March 2022 for the murder of Lieutenant Deborah Clayton. Markeith's first trial for the murders of Sade Dixon and Ronald Stewart began on October 7th, 2019. In Orange County Circuit Court before Judge Letitia Marquez. The prosecution team was led by Assistant State Attorney Rich Buxman and Assistant State Attorney Deborah Bilera, while Markeith was represented by public defenders Tesha Allison and Andrew Evans. Markeith had repeatedly disrupted pre-trial hearings with outbursts, threats toward the judge and prosecutors, and refusal to cooperate with his own attorneys, behavior that required him to be restrained and that demonstrated his contempt for the legal process. The trial lasted 2 weeks and featured testimony from dozens of witnesses, including forensic experts, medical examiners, ballistic specialists, and Sade Dixon's family members. The medical examiner testified that Sade had been shot 7 times, including multiple shots to her abdomen that killed her unborn baby, and that the pattern of wounds showed she was shot while trying to protect her pregnancy. Ronald Stewart had been shot 4 times, including a fatal shot to the head at close range. Ballistics evidence showed all the bullets recovered from the victims, and the scene came from the same 9mm pistol, the gun found near Markeith when he was captured on January 17th. DNA evidence placed Markeith at the scene. Multiple witnesses testified about seeing Markeith fleeing the scene immediately after the shootings. His own social media posts threatening Sade in the weeks before her death were presented as evidence of premeditation. But the most powerful evidence was the interrogation video. When prosecutors played the footage showing Markeith smiling and admitting that situation happened while discussing the murders, several jurors visibly reacted with disgust. Markeith's attempt to claim self-defense was demolished by the forensic evidence showing Sade and Ronald were shot while unarmed and attempting to flee or defend themselves, not attacking Markeith. The defense's case was minimal. They called no witnesses and presented no evidence, instead relying on their closing argument to claim the prosecution hadn't proven premeditation beyond reasonable doubt. Defense attorney Tesha Allison argued that the killings might have been crimes of passion rather than premeditated murders, which could affect sentencing. But the argument fell flat given the evidence of Markeith bringing a loaded gun to Sade's location, the 7 shots fired at a pregnant woman, and his complete lack of remorse. On October 23, 2019, after just 4 hours of deliberation, the jury found Markeith Lloyd guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder for killing Sade Dixon and Ronald Stewart, and guilty of third-degree murder of an unborn child for killing Sade's unborn baby. Under Florida law, conviction of first-degree murder requires a separate penalty phase where the jury recommends either death or life imprisonment. The penalty phase began immediately, with prosecutors presenting aggravating factors. The murders were cold-blooded, premeditated, and especially heinous because one victim was pregnant. Markeith had an extensive criminal history showing a pattern of violence, and he showed absolutely no remorse. The defense presented mitigating factors including Markeith's troubled childhood and claims of mental health issues. But in the penalty phase, the jury deadlocked. Under Florida law at the time, a jury had to unanimously recommend death for a death sentence to be imposed. The jury voted 10-2 in favor of death, but because it wasn't unanimous, Judge Marquez was required to sentence Markeith to life in prison without possibility of parole for Sade's murder, life without parole for Ronald's murder, and 30 years for the unborn child's murder. Markeith escaped the death penalty in this trial, but he still faced the more serious case, the murder of Lieutenant Deborah Clayton. The trial for Lieutenant Clayton's murder was delayed for nearly 2 years due to COVID-19 court closures and extensive pre-trial motions. Markeith continued his disruptive behavior, requiring him to be removed from multiple hearings. He filed motions accusing his attorneys of being part of a conspiracy against him, motions claiming he was being tortured in jail, and motions demanding the charges be dismissed because he claimed self-defense. All these motions were denied. The second trial finally began on October 25, 2021, again before Judge Letitia Marquez in Orange County Circuit Court. The prosecution team was led by Assistant State Attorneys Ryan Williams and Dan Faggard. Markeith was represented by public defenders Roger Whedon and Lisa Bainbridge. his fourth set of defense attorneys after he had repeatedly fired previous lawyers. This trial was even more emotionally charged than the first because the victim was a police officer killed in the line of duty. The courtroom was packed every day with Orlando police officers wearing Lieutenant Clayton's badge number, her family members, and community members who wanted to see justice for the fallen officer. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. The Walmart surveillance video showing the entire shootout was played multiple times, clearly showing Markeith pull his weapon first and fire at Lieutenant Clayton without any provocation beyond her ordering him to surrender. Ballistics evidence showed bullets from Markeith's gun killed Lieutenant Clayton. Medical examiner testimony described her fatal injuries. Multiple officers who were nearby testified about hearing the gunfire and seeing Markeith flee the scene. But once again, the interrogation video was the most powerful evidence. Prosecutors played the full 43-minute video showing Markeith smiling when discussing shooting Lieutenant Clayton, showing no remorse, and attempting to justify murdering a police officer as self-defense, even though the surveillance video clearly showed he shot first. The jurors watched Markeith on screen, displaying the same arrogant, remorseless attitude he showed sitting at the defense table, confirming that this wasn't an act or the result of medications, but who Markeith truly was. The defense's strategy was to claim Markeith genuinely believed he was acting in self-defense, that he panicked when he saw the uniformed officer, and that he shot Lieutenant Clayton thinking she was going to kill him. They called expert witnesses to testify about fight or flight responses and to suggest Markeith's criminal history and experiences with police had created a paranoid fear of law enforcement that caused him to react instinctively. But this defense was demolished during cross-examination. Prosecutors pointed out that Markeith's own social media posts before the murders showed he didn't fear police. He hated them and advocated violence against them. The surveillance video showed Markeith deliberately pull his weapon and shoot first, not react in fear to an imminent threat. And the interrogation video showed Markeith take ownership of the shooting, not claim he was afraid or acting in panic. Closing arguments took place in February 2022. Prosecutor Ryan Williams delivered a powerful summation, reminding the jury that Lieutenant Deborah Clayton was a wife, mother, and dedicated public servant who was simply doing her job when Markeith executed her in a parking lot. Williams showed the surveillance video again, freezing it at keyframes, showing Markeith pulling his weapon before Lieutenant Clayton could even react, proving this was not self-defense, but premeditated murder of a police officer. Williams also addressed the interrogation video directly. You've seen Markeith Lloyd in his own words, on camera, smiling and smirking when discussing killing a police officer. You've heard him show no remorse, no sadness, no human empathy for taking a mother away from her son, a wife away from a husband. He showed you exactly who he is, a cold-blooded cop killer. And Florida law provides one appropriate punishment for cop killers: death. Defense attorney Roger Whedon gave a closing argument, acknowledging the difficulty of defending Markeith, but urging the jury to consider that life in prison without parole was sufficient punishment, that executing Markeith wouldn't bring Lieutenant Clayton back, and that the death penalty should be reserved for the absolute worst cases. It was a valiant effort, but the evidence was overwhelming. On March 1, 2022, after 8 hours of deliberation, the jury found Markeith Lloyd guilty of first-degree murder of a law enforcement officer, attempted first-degree murder of other officers at the scene, and carjacking. The verdict brought tears and relief to Lieutenant Clayton's family and the Orlando police officers who had packed the courtroom every day of the trial. The penalty phase began immediately. Unlike the first trial where the jury deadlocked, this time the jury unanimously recommended death after just 2 hours of deliberation. On March 2nd, 2022, Judge Letitia Marquez formally sentenced Markeith Lloyd to death by lethal injection for the murder of Lieutenant Deborah Clayton. She also sentenced him to consecutive life sentences for the attempted murders and carjacking. During the sentencing hearing, Lieutenant Clayton's husband and son gave emotional victim impact statements that left few dry eyes in the courtroom. Lieutenant Clayton's husband, Cedric, described Deborah as his soulmate, his best friend, and an incredible mother who had been stolen from their family by Markeith's senseless violence. Their son, who was 17 at the time of his mother's murder and 22 at sentencing, described growing up without his mother, missing her at his high school graduation, knowing she would never meet his future wife or children, and living every day with the pain of knowing she died trying to arrest a violent criminal. Sade Dixon's mother also gave a statement, reminding the court that Markeith had destroyed multiple families, not just the Claytons, but the Dixons and Stewarts as well. She described Sade as a loving daughter who was excited about becoming a mother, who had tried to protect herself from Markeith but couldn't escape his violence, and who died along with her unborn baby because Markeith couldn't accept rejection. Markeith was given an opportunity to address the court before sentencing. He stood at the defense table, wearing the red-tinted glasses that had become his signature look, and delivered a rambling statement claiming innocence, blaming the police for persecuting him, and insisting he had acted in self-defense. He showed no remorse, no acknowledgement of the pain he had caused, no acceptance of responsibility. His statement only reinforced the jury's decision that he deserved death. Judge Marquez addressed Markeith directly before imposing sentence. Mr. Lloyd, you have been convicted by a jury of your peers of murdering Orlando Police Lieutenant Deborah Clayton, a public servant who dedicated her life to protecting this community. You murdered her in cold blood as she tried to arrest you for murdering your pregnant ex-girlfriend and her brother. You showed no remorse then, and you show no remorse now. The jury has unanimously recommended that you be sentenced to death, and I agree with their recommendation. You will spend the rest of your life on death row, and ultimately you will face execution for your crimes. May God have mercy on your soul, because this court has none. Markeith was immediately transported from Orange County Jail to Florida State Prison in Rayford, where he was placed on death row to await his execution. As of November 2025, Markeith remains on death row, having filed multiple appeals challenging his conviction and death sentence. In August 2024, the Florida Supreme Court affirmed his conviction and death sentence, finding no reversible error in the trial proceedings and concluding that the death penalty was appropriate given the heinous nature of the crime and the overwhelming evidence of guilt. Markeith has also appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, arguing that his death sentence violates constitutional protections because he claims he was not mentally competent to stand trial, and because he alleges excessive force was used during his arrest. As of November 2025, the Supreme Court has not agreed to hear his case, and his appeals are likely to continue for several more years before his execution is carried out, if it ever is. The case of Markeith Lloyd had profound and lasting impacts on the Orlando community, law enforcement, and the families of his victims. Lieutenant Deborah Clayton's murder sparked an outpouring of grief and support from across Florida and the nation. Her funeral was attended by thousands of police officers from agencies across the country, all coming to pay their respects to a fallen sister in blue. Orlando renamed the section of West Colonial Drive where she was killed Lieutenant Deborah Clayton Memorial Highway in her honor, and a memorial was erected at the location. The Orlando Police Department established the Deborah Clayton Scholarship Fund to support the education of children of police officers killed in the line of duty. The OPD Training Academy was renamed the Deborah Clayton Training Center, ensuring that every new Orlando police officer would be reminded of Lieutenant Clayton's sacrifice during their training. Her legacy lives on, not just in memorials and scholarship funds, but in the officers she mentored and trained during her career, many of whom have gone on to leadership positions within OPD. For Deputy Norman Lewis, the Orange County Sheriff's deputy who was killed in the traffic accident during the manhunt, his death was recognized as being in the line of duty, and he was honored alongside Lieutenant Clayton at memorial services. Deputy Lewis's family received full benefits, and his name was added to law enforcement memorial walls honoring fallen officers. The interrogation video of Markeith Lloyd has become something of a legend in law enforcement and legal circles, used in training for prosecutors and police officers as an example of how a suspect's demeanor and statements can be as powerful as explicit confessions. The video is particularly instructive because it shows how someone can incriminate themselves without saying, "I did it." Markeith's admissions about having to defend himself, his acknowledgements that situations happened, and most damningly, his smiling and smirking when discussing the murders, all painted a picture of guilt that no jury could ignore. The case also sparked discussions about Florida's death penalty laws and procedures. After Markeith's first trial resulted in a 10-2 jury vote for death, but he received life in prison because Florida law at the time required unanimity. The state legislature debated whether to change the law to allow non-unanimous death recommendations. Ultimately, Florida kept the unanimity requirement, but Markeith's second trial showed that when the evidence is strong enough and the crime heinous enough, juries will unanimously vote for death, as they did in his case. The case highlighted the dangers law enforcement officers face every day, particularly when dealing with violent fugitives. Lieutenant Clayton knew Markeith was wanted for double murder, knew he was armed and dangerous, but she didn't hesitate to confront him because that was her job, to protect the public by taking dangerous criminals off the streets. Her courage and sacrifice reminded communities across America of the risks police officers take and the debt of gratitude owed to them. For the families of the victims, there has been no closure, no healing that makes their losses bearable. Lieutenant Clayton's son graduated high school and college without his mother there to celebrate. Sade Dixon's mother will never hold her grandson, never see the child Sade was so excited to bring into the world. Ronald Stewart's family lost a brother, son, and uncle who was simply trying to protect his sister when he was killed. The title of this case, "He Killed a Cop on Camera, Then Smiled During His Interrogation," captures the essence of what made Markeith Lloyd's crime so shocking and what sealed his fate on death row. The surveillance video showing him execute Lieutenant Deborah Clayton in a parking lot in broad daylight was damning enough, but the interrogation footage showing him smile and show no remorse when discussing her death revealed the true depth of his depravity and convinced the jury he deserved the ultimate punishment. Markeith's case serves as a reminder that evil exists, that some people lack the basic human qualities of empathy and remorse that make society function, and that the criminal justice system must be prepared to deal with the worst offenders in appropriate ways. Markeith Lloyd was not someone who made a mistake or acted in a moment of passion. He was a career criminal who methodically murdered 4 people, including an unborn baby, across 2 separate incidents, who showed no remorse for any of his victims, and who smiled on camera when discussing killing a police officer. The interrogation footage also demonstrates a critical lesson for criminal suspects. Everything you say and do in police custody is being recorded and can be used against you in court. Markeith apparently believed invoking his Miranda rights would protect him from consequences, but his voluntary statements before invoking, his demeanor throughout the interrogation, and his body language and facial expressions all became powerful evidence against him. The camera captured everything, every smile, every smirk, every moment of arrogance, and preserved it for the jury to see exactly who Markeith Lloyd was when he thought he could justify murdering a police officer. For law enforcement, the case validated the importance of video recording all interactions with suspects. The interrogation footage provided irrefutable evidence of Markeith's state of mind, his lack of remorse, and his acknowledgement of the killings. Without that video, jurors would have only had written transcripts and officers' testimony about what Markeith said. The video allowed jurors to see and hear Markeith for themselves, to observe his demeanor, to watch him smile when discussing murder, creating an impact that no transcript could match. As of November 2025, Markeith Lloyd remains on Florida's death row, one of approximately 300 inmates awaiting execution in the state. He spends 23 hours per day in a single cell, allowed out for 1 hour of recreation in a small outdoor cage. He has no cellmate, limited contact with other inmates, and restricted visitation privileges. His appeals will likely continue for 5 to 10 more years, possibly longer, before all legal avenues are exhausted, when his execution finally comes, if it comes, given the long appeals process and the possibility of executive clemency. Markeith will be strapped to a gurney and administered a lethal cocktail of drugs designed to stop his heart. He will die in a sterile execution chamber, surrounded by witnesses, including members of his victims' families, corrections officials, and media representatives. It will be a clinical, bureaucratic death, nothing like the violent, terrifying deaths he inflicted on Sade Dixon, Ronald Stewart, their unborn baby, and Lieutenant Deborah Clayton. The question of whether the death penalty serves justice or simply perpetuates cycles of violence is beyond the scope of this case. What is clear is that 12 jurors, after hearing all the evidence and seeing Markeith smile during his interrogation, unanimously concluded that his crimes were so heinous, his lack of remorse so complete, and the danger he posed so profound that death was the only appropriate punishment. Whether one agrees with that decision or not, it reflected the conscience of the community and the requirements of Florida law. Lieutenant Deborah Clayton will never come home to her family. Sade Dixon will never hold her baby. Ronald Stewart will never celebrate another birthday with his family. An innocent unborn child will never take a breath. These losses are permanent, irreversible, and devastating. Markeith Lloyd caused all of this pain, and the video evidence, particularly that 43-minute interrogation showing him smile and show no remorse, ensured he would be held fully accountable. The case stands as a reminder that cameras don't lie, that video evidence is often the most powerful tool prosecutors have, and that when a suspect sits in front of a camera and reveals their true character through their words, demeanor, and attitude, that revelation can be more damning than any forensic evidence or eyewitness testimony. Markeith Lloyd killed a cop on camera, then smiled during his interrogation. That footage sent him to death row, where he will remain until the state of Florida carries out his execution. Justice delayed, but ultimately served.